Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Asher Marketing Podcast. This podcast is hosted by Asher Agency, a full-service partner to clients nationwide. Asher's services include media planning, creative, digital and social, website development, public relations, printing and fulfillment, and more. Anything you need to connect with your prospects and tell your story. To learn more, visit asheragency.com or contact us at hello@asheragency.com. Our guest is Dr. Sudip Parikh. Dr. Parikh, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for joining me. You came very highly recommended from our mutual friend, Mike Fulton. And that is quite an endorsement because Mike knows just about everyone and speaks very highly of you. So thanks for doing this.
Oh, happy to do it. Happy to do it.
Well, Dr. Parikh, as you and I have discussed on this podcast, we talk about career path, we talk about your organization and the work that you do. And I want to start with the first of those. You obviously have a pretty big job these days, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what you were thinking about as a young person in terms of where you might go with your career and whether you followed a straight line to where you are today or if that took some twists and turns along the way. So tell us a little bit about all that.
Yeah, happy to. Well, maybe I'll start just way back and just say that, I usually describe myself as a product of three things: the Immigration and Nationalization Act of 1965, chain migration, and the Apollo program, the Apollo space program. And the reason why I say that is the Immigration and Nationalization Act of 1965 made it to where we allowed immigration of Asians again, which had not been possible up until then. And so in 1965, my uncle was a geologist working in Spain, and he got recruited to work at the Goddard Space Center on the Apollo missions. They needed a geologist for the Apollo missions. And so he comes over and moves to Maryland, and then he invites over through chain migration my father, who's a factory worker. My father's a factory worker, and my uncle then moves down to North Carolina and to go be a professor at Appalachian State University. And that's when my father came to the U.S. and he moved from Mumbai, a city of 15 million or so, to Boone, North Carolina, which had a population of 6,000, and he loved it. And so he stayed. And so without those three things, the law that made it possible for Asians to immigrate here, chain migration, and the Apollo space program, I wouldn't exist. And so I do take that to heart because my father is a factory worker, and so I'm the son of a factory, two factory workers and immigrants. And growing up in North Carolina, I didn't know what I could be. So I got through school, and counselors and others told me that I should probably go to college. I picked the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill because it had a good basketball team, and tuition was really, really cheap. It was a really good deal. And so I went there as a journalism major.
Okay.
And so just to talk about, is it a straight line? Well, the fact that I was a journalism major tells you that now it probably wasn't. I was a journalism major my first year at college, and then my advisor said, "Why are you taking calculus?" And I said, "Well, I like calculus." And he says, "Well, maybe you shouldn't be a journalism major."
Yeah, you don't hear that phrase a lot, so
yeah, exactly,
for sure. Yeah,
yeah. So I switched to something called material science, applied science, and while I was there, I got interested in biology, interested in how molecules worked. And so I went to a place called the Scripps Research Institute in California to get a PhD in basically biochemistry. And I moved across the country, moved to San Diego. And again, it was one of those things where I chose it because I could afford to do it. They paid for your education and they paid you a small stipend. So I did that. And then, it was time for me to graduate with my PhD and do what's called a postdoc, where you go and take more training somewhere else. And most people tend to do some training in the Boston area at MIT or Harvard or some, one of those schools. And so I'd planned that all out. But then my wife reminded me of a couple promises I had made. When I was when we were in Chapel Hill together, I said, "Hey, you want to move to California with me? Go get a graduate degree." And she said, "Well, two conditions. One is we get married, because I'm not coming all the way out there if we're not getting married. And I said, okay to that. And the second was, she said, I picked the second city. So you're picking San Diego, I get to pick the next city. And she's a lawyer, so she chose Washington, of course, because that's where lawyers go, I guess. And so we ended up in Washington. When it turned out I was going to go to Washington, not Boston, I decided that maybe I better do something besides science. Washington, the main thing to do is policy and politics. And so I got myself a fellowship to work at the National Institutes of Health as a policy person, as what's called a presidential management intern, which was basically here's a small salary. There's the NIH campus. Go find something to do. And I found something to do. I followed around the NIH director, and that led through a series of incredible coincidences to a detail on Capitol Hill and the Appropriations Committee. And I ended up spending 9 years on the Appropriations Committee staff, working for Ted Stevens and Thad Cochran and Arlen Specter on the Republican side. And then the Democrats at the time were folks like Robert Byrd and Daniel Inouye and Tom Hart.
That was somewhat of an advisory role, correct? Helping them understand what issues were important and what deserved funding, what might the priorities be. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. The Appropriations Committee, I didn't know what the word appropriations meant. It means spending money. Yeah. I had no idea. And so I got the title of Science Advisor to the Appropriations Committee. But I did the work of a professional staff member, which is you negotiate line items in an appropriations bill. And there's thousands of line items that make up a $165 billion appropriations bill. And staff works through each line item. The Republicans, the Democrats on the Senate side, then the Republicans and Democrats on the House side, and you have to come to an agreement. And so that's what we did.
All right. So, and that led you to where you are today, correct?
It did, yeah. So after that, when I left the Hill, I went to a place called Battelle, which is a large research and development organization based in Columbus, Ohio. Eventually, I ran the Health and Consumer Solutions business unit there. And then I went to a place called DIA Global, which is a think tank that thinks about the harmonization of pharmaceutical regulations around the world. And that led to here, the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Okay. So was it your turn to pick a city and you picked Columbus, Ohio?
Well, no, I worked remotely. I worked here and they had an office in DC and I went to Columbus once a month. So.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, that's a fascinating story, and it is a little bit of a winding road. But I'd like to focus on where you are now, and I'd like to dig in a little bit about the organization that you lead, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And there is, if I'm not mistaken, there is a little bit of a journalism angle because you're the executive publisher of the Science family of journals. So that's a mouthful. So if you don't mind, from your perspective, tell us about the work that you do in the organizations that you lead.
Yeah. So yes, the AAAS, as we call it, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is a association of scientists and engineers around the world. It was founded 175 years ago. So it's an organization that has its roots pre-Civil War in the United States. And over the years, it has done many things. It convenes scientists to talk about science and to recognize great scientific excellence. It also publishes what's called Science, a Science magazine, which is probably the preeminent scientific journal in the United States. If I'd say that with, you should know that I have a conflict of interest there. And as executive publisher, we have a pretty large operation. We have probably one of the largest, if not the largest, science journalism group in the world. So we have an independent news team that, just like with every other newspaper or magazine, as publisher, they get to have editorial independence. I let them write what they want to write, and I have to work out the business side of things. And then the rest of the association does things like work on science policy and science advocacy. It's a really extraordinary organization of about 500 permanent staff, and then about 300 scientists that go through, an additional 300 scientists who are placed as policy fellows all over the federal government, and then a whole bunch of volunteers all around the world.
Well, that's fascinating work and important work. And I would imagine, and this is probably going to be an understatement, but I would imagine that work has changed dramatically in the last 3 or so years. Tell us a little bit about where your focus is today. What are the priorities? What are you trying to focus on and encourage your team to focus on? Because there's a lot of ground you could potentially cover. You know, you and I discussed right before we hit record that while this is the Asher Marketing Podcast, marketing is the least important word in that phrase. But you know, there's a sense here of trying to advocate, trying to promote, the different fields that you represent. So tell us what's most important in that, and where you focus and prioritize.
Yeah, this organization's got a really wonderful mandate, and that is that we have a vision of what we want to try to accomplish, and that is that we want to create a boldly inclusive, mobilized, and global scientific community. So the subject of that is the scientific community. That's what we can create. That's what we can reach, and that scientific community can then ignite and enable and celebrate scientific excellence. And science-informed decisions and actions. And when you have a vision like that to create a scientific community that leads to scientifically sound and informed decisions, you get a better world because you start to make evidence-based decisions, not decisions based on hope or decisions based on a feeling. And that is our vision. And so to accomplish that, we've got four strategic goals that we try to use. The first is the goal that my predecessors 175 years ago would recognize, and that is to advance scientific excellence. And that means, when we publish in the pages of Science arguments between scientists about what the right hypotheses are, that's advancing scientific excellence. When we recognize the James Webb Space Telescope for the incredible amount of awe that it enables, when we recognize gene editing because we know that it can create cures for disease. That's not something we used to talk about as scientists. Now we say the word cure. That's the kind of thing that I mean when I talk about our first strategic goal of advancing scientific excellence. The second is we then foster the inclusion that is an equity that is really inextricably linked to scientific excellence. It turns out that if you want to land a helicopter on Mars, or if you want to work on a vaccine, or if you want to develop the next generation technology, it turns out that the teams that do that are diverse. They have people with all kinds of points of view, because those points of view lead to better questions and better answers. And so we've recognized that. We made it a part of our strategic focus. The third goal is to build trust among scientists and their communities. And what we mean by that is, look, if you want to build trust is gained in teaspoons and lost in buckets. And the only way to build trust is to actually show up in your community. And that's one thing that scientists, we haven't done well. We like to cloister ourselves into our laboratories and around our telescopes and learn the wonders of nature. Sometimes we don't like to participate in a PTA meeting, or we don't want to participate in a school board meeting, or we don't want to run for office. And that's something that's very important. We got to make sure we do that. So we do that here at this organization in terms of embedding scientists with other parts of their community, faith leaders, pastors and rabbis, and clerics. We want to make sure that we've built relationships in our neighborhoods, journalists, policymakers, judges. We have programs that embed scientists with judges so that judges start to see what scientific evidence looks like. And then fourth is we work on science policy. We want to make sure that the policy for science is as good as possible, which means advocating for more money for science. It means advocating for more scientific diplomacy around the world. It also means infusing science into decision making, and that's at every level. When a county chooses to put a turf field or a natural field at a high school, that decision requires scientific evidence, and so we want to make sure that we're doing that at every level of decision making.
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit there to unpack, and that's a great description. Thank you. I want to follow up on a couple things. So let's talk about the advancement of STEM education and making sure that scientific endeavors and scientific careers in science are available to a diverse population. How is your organization influencing that? I mean, from I'm a little bit involved in higher ed, and I know that one of the challenges with higher ed is it tends to serve really well the upper income families in America, and it doesn't always do a great job with lower income families. When I'm talking about diversity, we're talking about economic diversity.
Yep.
How can your organization influence policy and society so that more individuals have the opportunity to pursue what can be expensive college degrees in fields that require investments by colleges and universities? What can you do to influence that?
Yeah. Oh boy, there's a lot along that chain. So let's start real early. It turns out that if you're a child and you're going anywhere in this country, it depends on where you are in terms of what the odds are that you're going to get into the sciences. If you grew up on the East or West Coast, then you've got a better chance at it than if you grew up in the middle of the country. Yep. I'm simplifying it, probably oversimplifying a bit, but that's the case.
Yep.
The next thing that happens, though, is that what we've got to do is make sure that if you are a child growing up in the Mississippi Delta or the Appalachian Mountains or the Central Valley of California, that you have access to great curriculum, that you have a sense of belonging in the sciences, which means that you have scientists that you recognize and are part of your community and that participate in your community. It means advocating with universities to make science education inclusive, not exclusive. What do I mean by that? So when you graduate from high school, and if you went to a poor high school and you didn't have AP calculus, and then you get thrown into a college environment where everybody else around you has had AP calculus, it doesn't matter how smart you are. They're just way ahead of you. And a lot of colleges use that as a weed out course, right? We talk about it as a course where you look to your left, look to your right, and one of you is not going to be here come next semester. That is a great way of getting rid of talent, because it turns out that not everybody is getting the same basic information getting into school. So what we try and do is say, what do we do to make education inclusive, where we say, all right, we're all in a calculus class. Now, every one of you is capable of doing this work. We are confident of that. Now, some of you are going to need support to get there. It means you're going to need extra tutoring. You're going to need mentoring from another student. You're going to need time set aside for doing the work. That's the kind of thing that we can advocate with universities for. The next thing is at the federal level, we can advocate for more funding for the salaries for graduate students. Graduate students get paid, but they get paid tiny amounts of money at some places and large amounts of money at others. We need to make sure that no matter where you are, you have a wage on which you can live and pay health insurance and not feel like you're throwing away 10 years of your life to go to graduate school and get a postdoctoral degree. Those are just a huge number of things on the pipeline that we can help with. So that's what we try and do.
Sure. Well, and in terms of STEM education, it obviously starts very early, elementary school, perhaps even sooner. This is a big question, but how do you make those careers more interesting to kids when that work is difficult? Is it making it more experiential so they're actually working on things with their hands? Is it changing the way that we educate students? What do you think is the sweet spot there in terms of making STEM education more appealing to students at a younger age?
Yeah. Those of us who got into STEM, we all have a teacher or a person who got us excited about this, who got us excited about what's possible. And a lot of what gets kids excited is being able to work on something that actually makes sense in their world. So can they work on an app that does something valuable for the neighborhood in which they live? Can they work on a problem that makes it to where the water that's in the creek next to their house is water they can play in? Can they look at the life, at the living things, the living organisms in the woods that are near their house, and try and make sure that when the bulldozers come 2 miles away, that they can help save some of the biodiversity back there because they like going back there. And so when you create challenges like that for students that they can work on, and it's easily, an elementary school kid is clearly able to actually make a difference, even in some of those questions. How do you make them a part of it? Give them the chance to actually do science, not read about science. Because when you do science, there's a joy in science. that really it grabs hold of you and doesn't let it go ever.
Yeah, well, I think there's something really important, a through line here. I may not think I'm interested in science, but if I'm a football player and they're changing the turf on my field, maybe it's an opportunity to introduce, what science really is and how that affects that student.
Absolutely, right? I mean, the first time that I watched a football game on a turf field and watched these little black pellets fly up out of the ground, it's a question of why is that? What are those?
Yeah.
What do they mean for health? What do they mean for injuries when I hit the ground? And those are things that science can tell you about. And it's not nearly as clunky or maybe even boring sounding as the traditional, if a train's coming at you this fast and you're going this fast, how long till you hit each other? No, but there's very few kids who want to solve that problem. But if you tell them that there's football players on a football field and you're wondering what's the force with which they're hitting the ground after they've gotten a catch, hey, that's a question I'd want to know about.
Yeah, for sure. And when I was a kid, I was probably I was one of the least interested kids in all types of schoolwork, primarily science, when I was a kid. And if somebody had asked me, are you interested in geometry? I would have said, absolutely not. But if somebody had said, are you interested in why it's easier to steal second base than third base? I would have been interested. Turns out it's a geometry problem, right?
Yeah. I love that. That's a great one.
So another thing that I want to ask you about, and I ask this with respect for the fact that it's a can of worms, is the trust issue. And it's kind of amazing to me that in my lifetime that we're at a point where science needs to be defended, where we are in sort of a crisis of trust in this country in a lot of different ways, but the ways in which it's impacted science. In an environment, a society that's as divided as we are, how do you start those conversations in a way that's constructive and productive to get people united in moving society, the humanity forward by looking at scientific solutions to problems and not seeing that as somehow the enemy? I know that's a big question, but I have to imagine it's on your mind, given what's happened the last few years.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about this and working on it. There are no easy solutions. I wish there were. This is not an ad campaign that's going to rebuild trust in science.
Sure.
That's not going to happen. And as I said before, building trust is, you do it in teaspoons, you lose it in buckets. That's true in a rate. That's true in your marriage. It's true in a society. And so what we've decided to do here at AAAS is to start building trust in teaspoons. And that means making sure that there are relationships formed before a crisis. So I told you that we work with faith leaders. What we do there is we've been doing a program called Science in the Seminaries, where we work to put science curriculum into seminaries. So as pastors or future pastors go through their work, they are learning about science. They may not agree with all of it, right? It may, in fact, conflict with some of the teachings of their faith. But while we're creating that curriculum, we're also building relationships so that now a pastor knows a scientist by name. They've probably had dinner together. They've worked together. And it's amazing how that little bit of bonding, a little bit of trust that you build by talking about things that you both care about, whether it's your families, your neighborhood, your city, that can build the levels of trust so that you recognize that you're both, at the end of the day, trying to accomplish similar things. And then when there is a public health crisis and there is the recommendation not to sing in church, if there's a government official or a scientist you've never met who comes to your church and tells you that, why on earth would you believe them? Yeah. And I completely understand that. Yeah. But if it's a friend, someone you've known, and they're telling you that, at this moment, it's not because we want you to stop singing in church. It's because right now there's a public health crisis that we can combat. You can do that better if you've got a little bit of a foundation of a relationship already in hand. And so we build programs to do this. And we do it with journalists, we do it with judges, we do it with faith leaders, and we do it with politicians. And then the hope is that the ripple effect from that then reaches out into the community at large. But it's a long-term problem. And some of it comes from, scientists we're not blameless here. We like jargon. We like to talk in jargon. We like to use big words. And the reason we use big words is because we have to be very precise with one another.
Yeah.
It turns out you don't have to do that when you're talking to your parents or when you're talking to your siblings, who are also smart people. They just never learn that jargon because they've got whatever jargon they work in.
Yeah.
And so we as scientists have to be better communicators and better listeners so that we can be a part of a trusted community.
Yeah, well, it all ties into what you said about diversity. You look at what's happened with the acceptance of Eastern medicine, at least to some degree, something that people weren't even talking about, again, well within my lifetime. And it's really difficult to completely ignore or dismiss information that comes from a neighbor or a coworker. It's really easy to ignore that information when it comes from someone you don't know. So I love what you're saying there. I think it is the only way we're going to get through this, and it's not going to happen overnight for sure.
Yep, it's gonna be a lot of work, but I'm optimistic, and the reason I'm optimistic is that we're living in a golden age of science. I used to when I was a kid dream about could I have been alive during the 1905 and had breakfast with Einstein when he was working on relativity, or 1620 when Isaac Newton was working out gravity, or the 800s and 900s when there were a whole bunch of scientists in the Islamic world who were working on amazing things. But now I realize that the golden age of science is right now. Right now, we are seeing explosions in every field of knowledge. And it's a race. It's a race between those understandings and the progress that can come from them and our disillusionment and disconnection with each other and with science. And so I'm confident that our better angels are going to win. And the reason why I am is because I know there are a lot of good people working really hard to rebuild trust and to hopefully create a bond between the people that fund science, my mom and dad who are factory workers, and the people that do science.
Yeah, well, and the analogy to the race, it seems like it used to be a marathon, and now it's a series of sprints.
Yes.
What I've heard from others, more intelligent than me, is all the innovation that was compressed into a short time out of necessity during the pandemic. We had to become a more digital society out of necessity. And what you're seeing with AI and its influence, obviously, I'm a marketing guy, so I think of the influence there, but its influence everywhere, and that has an opportunity to open more doors for the types of collaboration and conversation you're talking about. It also has the opportunity to make people even more polarized. So it's going to be an interesting few years to come for sure.
It is. And I'm not saying it might not get worse before it gets better.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that's not the case.
Let's hope.
All right. Well, let's pivot to some lighter fare. Really enjoy this. Really love what you have to say and the role you're playing. I'd like you to talk very broadly about career success. One of the things we ask our guests on this podcast is, from your perspective, what's the most important thing that you need to focus on if you want to build a fulfilling and successful career?
Yeah. The fulfilling part is really important. And to me, fulfilling means doing something that you actually like. And so, I've often said, don't choose what you're going to do next by, a metric of somebody else, the pay or the prestige or what you think is what everybody seems to be moving toward. Instead, choose the thing that you like and you care about. Make sure it's sustainable. There are some things that are obvious that are not going to, if you need to have a certain level of income because you got to pay your parents back or you've got to support a family, be knowledgeable about what each career path leads to. But then that's huge. That should be a huge set of choices even then. And once you've satisfied those basic needs, then choose the thing that makes you happy. And what I found is that, it will lead to other things. You can have 10 different careers before you're done. It's really more about what is the thing that's going to make me happy right now that fits with my particular lifestyle right now. I've got little kids. I need to be able to get home at 5 o'clock, or my kids are grown and I'm ready to work 18 hours a day because I want to change the world. You've got to decide for yourself what that is and stick to it for a little while. Don't let others metrics guide you.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Another thing that I'll mention is, when we talk about fulfillment, I think it's important to help young people understand sometimes that's different than happiness. My wife and I were having a conversation the other night, and she said, boy, for someone who loves his job, you seem like you're angry about it a lot. And I said, the way you get to fulfillment is through hard work. And there's times when it is difficult and you're passionate about it. So there's times you do have an emotional response, but it's more of a byproduct. The happiness is a byproduct of fulfillment. They're not one and the same. So
that's a really important distinction, I think.
Well, and so the young people who are listening, no, it's not that you find fulfillment through doing less work. You actually find it through doing more.
Yeah. Whenever you find that thing, there are times when you want to work 24 hours a day, and you recognize you need a balance and that you need your family and your friends as well. But boy, there are times when you just want to do the thing because it's that exciting, it's that important.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So this next question will provide you with a wealth of opportunities and how you can answer it. But, I always ask our guests about myths or misconceptions in their professional life that they'd like to clear up. What's maybe one thing that you wish people knew or understood differently about science than the current understanding?
Yeah. It's a worry that I have that folks are starting to see science as one more interest group, more stakeholder, that just needs to have its own set of lobbyists or its own set of marketers or its own set of communication tools to compete with every other interest group. And that really concerns me, especially when they see it as an interest group connected with one side or the other. I mentioned that I worked for Ted Stevens and Thad Cochran and Arlen Specter. Those were Republican senators. But really, I felt like I worked for the institution of the Senate. I wanted to make sure that they had the information they needed. They were the elected members of Congress. They got to make the decisions. But I wanted to make sure that it was the real information that they got, not what maybe you want to hear because you have a certain opinion or certain side of the political spectrum that you're on. And that's the myth I want to clear up, is that somehow science is just another interest group. It's not. Science is a process for trying to understand the world around us, and it's not always a linear track to getting answers. Sometimes we make progress, and then our hypothesis turns out to be wrong, and we change directions. Scientists change their minds all the time. That's part of what we have to do, because we don't know the answer right away. There's no answer key at the back of the book. We're working out those answers on the fly.
Yeah, well, and I think that's gotten confused because, it's always the pursuit of more knowledge, more understanding. And, I'm biased, but that shouldn't be controversial, but it seems like we've gotten in a position where it is, unfortunately.
We have. And it's something that, part of it is that we don't do a good job of teaching the scientific process. I never like the term "follow the science." Science is a process. It's not a big book of facts. We don't know all those answers, and we have to be upfront about that. And that's part of the communication work that we have to do as a profession, is to explain, not even to explain, to engage in a conversation, to let folks know that we know these things for sure. We have hypothesized these things, and we're working out whatever the next piece of understanding is. Yeah.
All right. One last question for you. In terms of the work that you do every day, I always ask guests if there is a tool, a trick, a hack, a shortcut, whatever it is, something. It could be an app. It doesn't have to be digital. Something you use that you think is underappreciated, that is important to you in your work, that you think more people could benefit from. Anything come to mind?
Yeah, the telephone. So I love apps. I love technology. I'm a technology geek. But it turns out that somewhere along the way, I think we've forgotten that there's incredible power in talking to someone voice to voice. Zoom these video conferences are even better. But I'll take voice, because with voice, in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you can get across your feelings about something without ever saying what your feelings are. You can get across the importance of something or the urgency of something without ever having to say it. it's an incredibly powerful tool, and that we need to remind ourselves that it is part of. It is one of the tools that we have at our disposal. Emails are great, texts are great, WhatsApp is great. All these things are important, but our voice-to-voice communication has an important role when you're trying to build a relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the key is to not over-index on the things that are convenient, email and text, especially when it's a conversation where you want people to understand where you're coming from an emotional standpoint, or you want to build a relationship. Really hard to do. It's funny. It's another old-fashioned tool. One of my favorite things I get to do in my professional life is I do some mentoring with a Division I college basketball team. And one of the things that they have in place is a mentoring program with a number of professions. And I encourage them to send a written thank you note after the first meeting, which makes me sound very old-fashioned, makes me sound like Emily Post, which I am not. But I tell them, when I walk around my office, I see tacked up on the wall in almost every office a handwritten thank you note. What I don't see is a printed out email that says thanks. Yep. So, the old-fashioned stuff, certainly I love email, I love texting, I love video conference, love all of it, but there's still a place. The hard part in our communication environment is there's so many tools, it's hard to know which was the right one to use. But I 100% agree. There are times when phone is a great choice.
It's a powerful thing to pick up the phone and call somebody and spend 5 minutes. Sometimes it's just a matter of checking in. You never know what the power of your voice can do to lift somebody's spirits who's on your team, to get them to follow you. Because so much of what we do is influence. It's not about who they report to or anything like that. You're influencing people every day, all the time, and that can be done with your voice and your the sound and your look.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Parikh, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. You do incredibly important work. I know you're busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today.
Hey, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
And thank you to everyone who took the opportunity to listen to this episode of the Asher Marketing Podcast. We'll be back next time with another great guest, and we hope you'll join us then.